Millions of Americans right now are sharing this really quiet but heavy anxiety. You're working hard, you're budgeting, you're cutting back on everything, and yet at the end of the month, the bank account is basically empty. For the longest time, people just dismiss this as some kind of personal failure, like, oh, you're just not saving right. But it's not just a feeling, and it's definitely not just you. It's a documented, structural reality. In this explainer, we're going to dive into official data from the Federal Reserve, the Congressional Budget Office, and the Census Bureau, and we're going to build this undeniable picture of what we call the Great American Squeeze. Okay, let's dive into this. Why can't Americans save money anymore? Seriously, why? Well, the answer is that the margin of error for the middle class has completely, literally evaporated. The gap between what it actually costs to just exist and what people earn has totally closed up. And to see just how severe this has gotten, we really only need to look at the latest numbers from the Federal Reserve. 3.0%. Yeah, according to Fed data from May 2026, the U.S. personal saving rate has just collapsed down to a staggering 3.0%. To put that bluntly, out of every single $100 a family brings home, they're only managing to hold on to just $3. It's this razor-thin margin, and it leaves households terrifyingly vulnerable to even the tiniest financial shock. Now, to really grasp the gravity of that 3% figure, we have to zoom out and look at the historical timeline. Back in 1980, when high interest rates actually incentivized you to save, that rate sat really comfortably between 10 and 12%. By the time we hit the Great Recession in 2008, it had dipped down to between 3.5 and 5%. Sure, we saw this massive, totally artificial spike up to 33% during the 2020 pandemic lockdowns, mostly because of forced savings and government checks, but look at where we landed today in 2026. At 3.0%, we are actually sitting lower than we were right before the 2008 financial crisis. I mean, this is a historic collapse. So, that brings us to the first piece of the puzzle, the daily bleed. How inflation is actively destroying our purchasing power. So where on earth is all that money going? Look, we're not talking about discretionary spending here. We're not talking about vacations or buying a new TV. We're talking about inescapable costs. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, overall inflation rose 4.2% by May 2026. But you have to look at the non-discretionary breakdown. Food, up 3.1%. Shelter, up 3.4%. And energy is surging by an absolutely brutal 23.5%, with gasoline alone spiking 40.5%. You can't just choose not to heat your home, right? You can't choose not to drive to work. These unavoidable spikes are hitting your wallet before a single dollar can even think about reaching a savings account. Now, what's really interesting about this is the fundamental math problem it exposes. You might hear these headlines saying, hey, aggregate incomes are growing. And, well, they are by an average of 2.1% annually. However, the Congressional Budget Office calculated that the price to maintain the exact same middle-class standard of living grew by 4.5%. The math here is just brutal. Your baseline costs are growing more than twice as fast as your real income. And the result of that? It's a quiet, continuous bleed. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that this inflation gap has effectively drained roughly $3,000 in purchasing power for middle-income families every single year. That's $3,000 completely swallowed up just to buy the exact same groceries you were already buying last year. It perfectly illustrates why skipping a few lattes or, canceling a streaming service isn't going to save you. You simply cannot budget your way out of a $3,000 structural deficit. It's impossible. Which leads us to our next major issue, the structural trap. Let's talk about the unavoidable cost of shelter. Because let's be real, the grocery store and the gas pump are only part of the equation here. We have to look at the biggest, most rigid expense in the American budget. Census Bureau data shows these massive jumps in the absolute cost of just keeping a roof over your head. From 2023 to 2024, median owner costs with a mortgage jumped to an inflation-adjusted $2,035 a month. Meanwhile, gross rent climbed to $1,487. Homeowners are now dedicating over 21% of their entire income just to housing costs. It's an ever-increasing, totally structural burden. And for renters, this long-term trend is literally the perfect example of the boiling frog effect. If we rewind 20 years ago to 2005, median gross rent was $728, which adjusts to about $1,176 in today's money. Fast forward to 2024, that median is now $1,487. That means renters today are paying over $300 more every single month in real inflation-adjusted terms for the exact same level of housing. That's a permanent $300 a month penalty applied directly to their ability to save. So the crucial point is how people are actually getting by. Let's look at the credit illusion and how we're surviving the squeeze on borrowed time. Think about it. If costs are skyrocketing and savings have collapsed to 3%, how is the American consumer still functioning? How are people still buying groceries, paying for healthcare, and keeping the whole economy moving? Well, the answer is an unprecedented reliance on borrowed time. $18.8 trillion. Let that sink in. That is the total household debt balance as of early 2026, according to the New York Fed. It is a staggering number. And guys, this isn't wealth creation. This is literally the mechanism millions are using simply to bridge the massive gap between their paychecks and reality. When we actually break down the composition of this $18.8 trillion burden, the story gets even clearer. We've got $13.19 trillion locked up in mortgages. Auto loans are sitting at nearly $1.69 trillion, and student loans are right behind at roughly $1.66 trillion. Oh, and let's not forget the $1.25 trillion in credit card debt. Are you noticing a pattern here? The vast majority of this burden is made up of strictly non-discretionary loans. You need shelter, you need a car to get to work, and education is constantly framed as the absolute prerequisite for a livable wage. This debt is tied directly to basic participation in the modern economy. And this brilliantly illustrates the breaking point of that entire system. Notice the flow of debt falling into serious delinquency, meaning it's 90 days or more past due. While credit cards and auto loans are holding high but steady, just look at student loans. The serious delinquency rate spiked to 10.86% by Q1 2026. Nearly 11% of student loan debt is in severe distress. This is the ultimate canary in the coal mine, showing us that the capacity to borrow and actually repay is hitting a very hard mathematical wall. And to make matters even worse, this mountain of debt is no longer cheap. Following some really aggressive tightening cycles, the federal funds effective rate was holding around 3.63% by May 2026. Carrying $18.8 trillion in debt in a high interest rate environment means that debt servicing costs have just absolutely skyrocketed. Every extra dollar spent paying high interest on a credit card or an auto loan is a dollar directly cannibalized from whatever leftover income households could have otherwise saved. It is, quite literally, a tax on survival. Now let's zoom out to the big picture, the macro consequence, and what this means for the future of the American middle class. So what does this toxic combination of near zero savings, wildly elevated daily costs, and mounting debt actually mean for the overall economy? Well, let's move to and see how this builds into what researchers call the savings destruction loop. It's like a giant, terrible puzzle. Step 1, rising inelastic prices, like your food and shelter, grow way faster than your wages. Step 2, purchasing power drops dramatically, draining capital straight out of the middle class. Step 3, just to maintain baseline living standards, households are forced to increase their debt. And finally, step 4, the high cost of servicing that new debt absolutely prevents any future saving, which sends us right back to step 1. It is a closed, systemic loop that actively drains capital. There's a quote from macroeconomic research that brilliantly summarizes the core thesis of all the data we've looked at today. It says, personal outlays and non-discretionary expenses have expanded at a rate that systematically outpaces disposable income growth. I mean, that hits the nail on the head. Households are not out there spending frivolously. They are literally forced to deplete their reserves, down to that 3.0% savings rate, just to survive baseline everyday consumption. All of this leaves us with a stark, defining question for the future of financial security in America. If the middle class is down to a 3% savings rate, facing unyielding structural inflation in housing and energy, and is entirely relying on $18.8 trillion of increasingly expensive debt just to survive, what happens to the US economy when that credit finally runs out? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and as always, stay curious.